So thanks everybody for bearing with us for a few minutes as we sorted out some technology issues. I'm going to start with some introductions. We also have Christine Daglett with us, who's helping with some tech issues, and she's going to be moderating the discussion period that'll come later in the event. But we're going to start with some talks. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for your patience as we sorted this out. I'm Trevor Norris. I'm the director of the Posthumanism Research Institute at Brock University, which is in St. Catharines, Canada. I wanted to welcome you to the first in a series of collaborations with the Latin American Posthumanism Network. We have another event planned in the winter, so keep your eyes open for updates about that. And also some events planned for next year for 25-26. Today we're featuring a talk by Dr. Victor Krebs and a response by PRI Associate Director Elizabeth Neswald. So I'll start with some introductions. Dr. Krebs is a professor of philosophy in the Humanities Department at the Pontifical Catholic University in Peru. He received his doctorate from the University of Notre Dame and is the author of, in English, Human Virility and Digital Life, Philosophical and Psychoanalytic Investigations, and he is the coordinator of the Latin American Posthumanism Network. Dr. Elizabeth Neswald teaches in the History Department here at Brock University. She is a historian of science and technology and is the author of several books and essays on topics such as the history of thermodynamics and the history of nutritional physiology. She received her doctorate from the Humboldt University in Berlin, and she is going to be responding to Victor Krebs' talk, and the title of his talk is Weird Matter Towards an Eco-Ontology. So thank you very much for joining us today, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Thanks for being here. First of all, I just want to thank Trevor and Elizabeth at the Posthumanism Research Institute at Brock University for the invitation, and to Gabi Balcarce for the Latin American Posthumanism Network for having made this meeting possible. I look forward to a rich collaboration between our both institutes. I want to talk a bit today about, in broad terms, our conception of the world and our place within it, in particular in the way in which our modern scientific mindset has caused a certain blindness to our place in the world that is behind what I consider to be the collapse in our environment that characterizes the Anthropocene, so called by many people. So I've prepared a short text called Weird Matter Towards an Eco-Ontology, which I will begin to read slowly and I hope clearly. I start with this little epigraph from Timothy Morton in Dark Ontology, Ecology, that says, "In the term weird, there flickers a dark pathway between causality and the aesthetic dimension, between doing and appearing, a pathway that dominant Western philosophy has blocked and suppressed." So I begin with a little prelude. Today's environmental crises feel like a persistent nightmare, replayed daily on the endless screens that surround us, with each update reminding us of climate chaos everywhere. Our interconnected lives make these events feel even closer, and us more vulnerable and helpless. Natural disasters proliferate, fueling anxiety and a growing sense of disorder that resonates in the rising social violence, political polarization, and extremism that characterizes our century. It's almost as though a global toxicity we're spreading, affecting not only our planet, but also our collective psyche. The rising awareness of our ecological interdependence that inevitably comes with our increasingly networked digital lives forces us to question some of our long-held assumptions. How did we come to view, for instance, nature as separate from ourselves? The earth as a standing reserve, in Heidegger's terms, disposed for our manipulation and control. And what would it mean to see it instead as a complex, interwoven system to which we are deeply bound by forces beyond our full understanding? What if we learn to see the earth not as something to fix or conquer, but as a shared home where we need now to learn to live and die together? There are three historical stops I want to make in the path I will trace to our present moment, just as a means of orientation and definition of what I am calling the modern scientific mindset. I want to mention Galileo, then Kant, and finally James Lovelock, whose Gaia theory at the end of the last century suggests that our deeply harmful impact on the planet is a result of a radical blindness resulting from that modern scientific mindset. And I want to argue that our present moment is both a wake-up call and an opportunity to learn new ways of seeing, understanding, and living within the enmeshed system we call Earth. I will close the reflection by appealing to what is called object-oriented ontology, to suggest what might be the perspective from which to foster the ecological sensitivity necessary to face a crisis or collapse of what some call the Anthropocene. So the paper is divided into two parts. The first part begins with the section called Shifting Focus. So let me start imagining the beginning of the modern period with Bruno Latour, who pictured Galileo standing by the Venetian lagoon on a chilly autumn night in 1609, peering through his telescope into the vastness of space. In that moment, a little over 400 years ago, he begins to see the Earth not as a flawed earthly realm distinct from the heavens, as Christian dogma had it then, but simply as one more unchanging planet among many, thus marking the birth of the objective, detached perspective of modern science, where Earth becomes just another object to be scientifically dissected, and, this is important, its aesthetic aspects as systematically disavowed. Before this shift, people saw nature as alive and deeply connected to human life. The natural world was filled with meaning and significance. Mountains, rivers, stars, and trees were symbols in a divine order, reflecting the interdependency of everything. Nature was thought to communicate with us, offering signs and mysteries to help us understand ourselves and the universe. But with the scientific revolution, the focus turns to what can be measured: size, motion, quantity, displaces, color, taste, texture. Nature becomes something to control and analyze, losing its intimate connection to humanity. This mathematical Cartesian posture drove incredible technological processes, as we know, but it also blinded us to our intrinsic bond with the natural world. Latour tells a story of modernity starting with that groundbreaking leap in Galileo, but ends with an abrupt return to reality. While Galileo's telescope gave us a detached view of Earth as an inert object subject to rational understanding and control, James Lovelock, at the end of the 20th century, offers a vital twist. He imagines instead a Martian astronomer observing Earth from his planet and discovering the exact opposite to Galileo. As Latour puts it, he saw that the Earth had the privilege of being in imbalance, which made it alive and vulnerable. In that twist, Lovelock brings back the vital aspects that Galileo's view had left out: the Earth's vibrant colors, its smells, textures, its birth, aging, and eventual death. Lovelock's Martian reminds us that Earth isn't just an object to manipulate, but a fragile, interlaced system to which we're intimately bound. So we move from Galileo's endless, pure universe to Lovelock's enclosed, opaque world, a planet wrapped in a thin, life-sustaining skin where everything is connected. Our atmosphere is permeable, leaving us vulnerable and showing that all things on Earth touch and influence one another. Immanuel Colcha thinks that the world, as he says, is a perpetual contagion. We can't be detached observers anymore. We're immersed in this delicate membrane that keeps us alive. This new way of seeing ourselves leads us to reflect more deeply on how our relationship with the planet cannot be about control as much as about our shared vulnerability and interdependence. Interdependence here is the key notion. The suggestion leads us to the idea of a cosmic symbiosis of which we're part. And that's the second part of this section, cosmic symbiosis. Salome Voegelin, a researcher on sound, points out that the COVID-19 pandemic made it impossible to ignore how deeply we're all connected through the air we breathe and everything we do. It exposed the tangled links between climate change, resource scarcity, migration, and issues of social justice, revealing how each crisis intersects with and amplifies all the others. As the challenges of the Anthropocene come into focus, we're seeing just how deeply interwoven we are with the world around us. In biology, for example, we're already seeing species as symbiotic complexes, ecosystems within themselves that blur the boundaries of the individual. In a world where everything is intertwined, the notion of insular individuals that prevailed in our Western consciousness, and particularly in the modern worldview, doesn't hold up. 90% of the cells in our bodies are bacterial, and half of our DNA comes from outside species. We share genes with organisms from chimpanzees to butterflies. Carbon and nitrogen cycles, fundamental to life, bind us to an intricate web that includes not just animals and plants, but minerals too, all connected through a seamless flow of interdependence. This interconnectedness shatters the illusion that we are separate from the earth. We are porous, overlapping entities in a vast web of life. If our spatial coordinates have been thus subverted, so are also our temporal coordinates. In this new geological era that we're calling the Anthropocene, and that's something that we can talk about because that's sometimes a controversial name for this time, our massive ecological footprint has shifted the scale of impact and pushed us to see our place in the flow of deep time rather than in isolated human events. In other words, human history has fused with Earth's history, becoming part of the long intertwined timeline of the planet and its matter. Jussi Parikka, the Finnish philosopher of technology, argues that this new age requires us to rethink history in terms of geology and environmental shifts, acknowledging that human activity has now woven itself into Earth's very structure. Human influence registers on a par now with glaciers and volcanic eruptions, demanding that we consider time not just in human terms, but in the vast cycles that have always encompassed minerals, microorganisms, fungi, plants, animals, and now even our digital and cybernetic creations. Our short-lived human concerns are now woven into geological time, a scale that stretches across millions of years of evolution and transformation. This means our actions ripple out in ways that affect far more than just the immediate future. They impact Earth's life cycles and ecosystems, which have sustained life for eons. We aren't separate from this world. We're participants in a vast flow of life processes that move on scales much larger than we have typically considered. The crisis of our new geological era then serves as a warning, exposing the perils of a detached Galilean fantasy that regards the Earth as a separate entity, an object to manipulate without repercussions. This perspective has only served to desensitize us to the living, entwined nature of our planet and our role in its self-destructive cycle. We've lived with the comfortable illusion that Earth is a static resource, ours to shape and exploit as we please. But the Earth isn't some passive backdrop for human life. It's a living, ever-evolving system shaped by our actions as much as we are shaped by it. Now, ecological awareness is, as Timothy Morton aptly puts it, that moment at which we find out that we are the tragic criminal. This new geological era challenges with this shocking discovery to break out of our human-centric view of time and embrace a new ethic of interdependence. We are not Earth's masters, we are its co-inhabitants, and only by embracing our interconnectedness can we begin to confront the challenges of our time. This profound bond compels us to rethink our place in the world and to acknowledge a reality that exists beyond the reach of human knowledge or control. So now I want to focus now on that world and its intrinsic autonomy, which I will relate to what Kant called the thing in itself. Kant distinguished, as I will develop below, between the world as we know it and the world as it is in itself. The first we can know, but the other remains always beyond human comprehension. I want to hone into this idea because I think it's essential to understand the blindness that we have and the new vision that we need for confronting the Anthropocene. So this is a new section, which I call the return of the thing in itself. At the dawn of modern science, Immanuel Kant set a powerful framework for understanding the world and our relationship with it that consolidated the scientific mindset of modernity. He made objective knowledge possible by setting limits to what our minds can actually grasp. We can know the world as it appears to us, but only as it appears to us. So at the same time that he supported and consolidated the Galilean fantasy, Kant was also acknowledging a reality beyond our reach, a deeper, unfathomable dimension beyond what we can observe and measure. This mysterious, unknowable realm, which he called the thing in itself, exists outside our own understanding, forever elusive and beyond the boundaries of human cognition. In acknowledging its existence as the ground from which we experience the world, Kant was leaving room in our worldview for what we may call the uncanniness of the ordinary, where there is room indeed for the Earth's intrinsic autonomy. But this insight was mostly overshadowed by the excitement of the scientific age. So we almost unconsciously set aside the idea of the unknowable side of reality and persuaded ourselves that only what we could measure and represent in concrete, rational, measurable terms was worth understanding. This shift led modern thought to focus narrowly on human perception and reason, missing out on the deeper view of our rootedness with nature and feeding our arrogance about our ability to control it. Driven by this hubris, modernity became a quest to shape and dominate the natural world, and nature became a mere resource bank waiting to be mined. In our push for control, we've lost sight of the fact that we are deeply woven into its cycles, that we cannot be outside observers, and much less rulers of nature. The desire for control embedded in modern Cartesian rationality that focused on certainty can no longer address the intricate, fragile complexity of life on Earth that is becoming so apparent in our experience of the Anthropocene. It's clear that we need to rethink our relationship with the world, recognizing our interdependence with nature, recognize our interdependence with nature in one step, and acknowledging that nature has a life and autonomy of its own as a second step. Here, Kant's thing in itself gains a new relevance. It isn't just an intellectual boundary, a limit beyond which we cannot say or know anything. It's also, and perhaps primarily, an ethical demand. The ongoing ecological crisis urges us to recognize that we live in a world far stranger and richer than we can ever fully grasp with reason alone. We live in a universe, Morton says, of finitude and fragility, a world in which objects are suffused with and surrounded by mysterious clouds of unknowing. Now, as we face the consequences of the Anthropocene, we need a way back to Earth, not as masters, but as sensitive participants in its life. Our survival within this delicate envelope of life, as Bruno Latour calls it, depends on our ability to coexist within a world that will never fully yield to human control. Okay, that's the first part of the essay, and I have tried to trace the development of a detached scientific viewpoint that began with Galileo's objective approach, which saw Earth as an object to be studied, analyzed, and ultimately controlled. This shift was intensified or consolidated by Kant's concept of the thing in itself, which limited human knowledge to what reason could perceive, leaving out the mysteries and autonomous forces beyond our grasp. This framework led to a view of Earth as a passive, manageable resource, sidelining the rich complexity of its ecosystems and contributing to the ecological crisis we face today. However, through Lovelock's view of Earth as a living system of interconnected elements, we begin to see the planet not as an inert matter, but as a vibrant, autonomous presence, one in which atmosphere, bacteria, plants, and minerals form a dynamic web of interdependence. This perspective revives Kant's thing in itself as a reminder of the ethical imperative to respect Earth's autonomy. In recognizing our role not as Earth's masters, but as its co-inhabitants, we pave the way toward a renewed ethic of interdependence, one that moves beyond control towards a respectful coexistence with the complex living world that sustains us. So now, in what follows, I want to go further to the themes of interconnectedness and interdependence by introducing Timothy Morton's concept of hyper-objects, vast complex entities like climate change, radioactive waste, plastic pollution, These hyper-objects urge us to recognize that we're entangled in forces that are far larger than ourselves, implanting a perspective that disrupts the default anthropocentric perspective, acknowledging that objects and non-human entities actively shape our world, that we humans are not the only agents, so that a new ethic of respect and coexistence is required. Okay, so I start now the last part of the paper, which starts with a section called hyper-objects. Okay, recapitulating, Kant taught us that we can only truly know what our minds can shape and structure. Yet this focus, as I have suggested, left out the richness, complexity, and secret agency of reality itself, the mysterious, elusive thing in itself. In the age of the Anthropocene, we now encounter entities like climate change, plastic waste, radioactive materials, even the internet. These hyper-objects that are so vast and complex that they slip beyond our ability to fully comprehend them. But despite their withdrawing from human beings, these entities still shape our lives in profound and often unpredictable ways. Imperceptible in their totality, they're omnipresent. They defy the human scales of time and space that we're used to. They force us to face the uncomfortable truth that we are not the only agents in the planet, and our actions are intricately intertwined with forces we can neither control nor fully comprehend. Living in a world dominated by hyper-objects is blurring the boundaries of the familiar world we thought we knew and reshaping how we think about existence. Morton describes this moment as an earthquake of being, a fundamental shakeup that reveals that parts of reality that our old ways of thinking ignored or disavowed. Morton is right when he observes that we've entered a new era where non-human forces can no longer be dismissed as background elements in our philosophical or social landscapes. From the world's most remote islands to its largest cities, everyone must contend with the increasing power of phenomena like high tides, mass extinctions, and extreme weather events. It's as if the repressed thing in itself has come back with the destructive force of hyperobjects, reminding us that the world isn't something we can fully grasp or dominate, and strengthening the call to recognize the agency and autonomy of non-human entities in shaping our shared world. Every choice, however small, triggers a chain reaction across an intricate network we can barely predict. From unprecedented floods to mass extinctions, these phenomena underscore the fact that the world responds often with unyielding force from the depths of its boundless mysteries. We are learning that things are not just connected to us, they have lives and complexities of their own. Climate change in this light isn't just a scientific or technical problem. It's a confrontation with something much bigger, challenging us ethically as well as practically. But modern thinking, focused on certainty and reducing the world to what we can immediately grasp, has overlooked the deeper, often hidden dimensions of existence. Yet in the Anthropocene, these depths come to the surface with undeniable force, revealing us that our supposed separation from nature is an illusion. We're entangled in a vast interconnected system that is far more intricate and elusive than we imagined. And Morton's hyper-objects invite us to embrace a new kind of humility, acknowledging that we're not the only players in this interconnected system. These hyper-objects remind us that our actions ripple out, interacting with forces far beyond what we can foresee or control. Now, object-oriented ontology, a 21st century school of thought that asserts that objects exist independently of human perception and are not ontologically defined solely by their relations to humans or other objects, provides a framework for restoring mystery and agency to our understanding of matter. So there's something behind everything I'm saying is we've lost the notion or the intuition of the depth of nature. That blindness is what's led to the Anthropocene. And what we need is to develop a new way of seeing where that inscrutable part of reality becomes part of our worldview. It invites us into a realm dense with opacities, contradictions, and paradoxes, a sense of uncanniness that a rationalist tradition typically must exclude. This uncanniness encompasses not only what is unknowable, but also what Jane Bennett calls thing power, an intrinsic negative power of recalcitrance within objects, revealing the active role non-human materials play in shaping our world. For Bennett, things are not simply passive resources, but active participants in reality, capable of exerting influence, provoking change, and even resisting human attempts at control. Thing power highlights a form of vitality and agency within matter that is palpable in examples like plastics in the oceans, radioactive particles in the atmosphere, and accumulated carbon in the biosphere, which are reminders that the world is vaster and darker than we often assume. Matter possesses its own power, sometimes positively, sometimes as a negative recalcitrance that defies easy control and subtly transforms the world. Objects and non-human forces are not merely part of our environment, but actors, agents within it, shaping history, ecology, and public life alongside us. The idea that objects are not static and passive entities, but active participants in reality, challenges the anthropocentric vision that has dominated modernity. Not only human beings possess intentionality. We must recognize that matter, minerals, plants, animals, even machines have a vitality of their own. Objects don't just exist to be used, they can reconfigure human experience and push back against our will. As Tim Ingold suggests, it's time to think not just of intersubjectivity, but of interagency, a perspective that includes human and non-human forces that shape the world together. By dismantling the idea that human beings are the only agents with power or intentionality in the world, this concept contributes to a vision of the world in cosmic symbiosis. It suggests that we are immersed in an ecosystem where everything, matter, objects, organisms, is intertwined and participates in the creation of reality. The world is a network of interdependencies where things, whether material objects or living beings, interact and affect the environment in a continuous way. Human and non-human elements coexist, and influence one another, making our actions inseparable from that larger web of interactions. This recognition has deep implications in the Anthropocene, where human actions have set off material processes, from plastic buildup in the oceans to melting glaciers, that now seem to take on lives of their own. Plastics drifting into the seas, radioactive particles lingering in the atmosphere, and carbon saturating the biosphere all serve as potent examples of matter's resilience, reminding us that the world is far more complex and unyielding than we thought. Once manageable and predictable, natural forces have become vast and uncontrollable. The residues of human intervention have taken on a relentless autonomy, with matter responding to us with an agency that challenges our cognitive and technological limits. The Anthropocene reveals that our actions are intricately tied to material forces in ways that are both profound and often invisible, prompting us to adopt, as I said before, a new ethic, not of control, but of respect and collaboration. Acknowledging the agency of matter also compels us to rethink what it means to know. If reality is infinitely more complex than we can ever fully understand, then we must cultivate a humility in our pursuit of knowledge. Rather than trying to control the world, we should strive to communicate with the forces that constitute it. Morton reminds us that we live in a universe cloaked in hermeneutic mystery that we can never fully decode. Science, in this light, becomes not only a tool of domination, but a way of collaborating with the unknown and with the unknown. It suggests an openness necessary to the resilience and intricate complexity of things. Okay, the last part of this section is called Weird Matter and the Dark Pathway. The Anthropocene confronts us then with vast, complex phenomena that defy our understanding. Hyperobjects highlight this challenge. Climate change, digital networks, and pollution don't stay out there for us to analyze from a safe distance. Instead, they surround and permeate our lives, making us realize that there is no outside perspective, no view from nowhere, as Galileo would put it, from which to observe. In fact, these forces are woven into our existence, inseparable from the material web that sustains life. To grasp this complexity, Morton proposes a concept called weird matter. In the term weird, Morton writes, and this is the epigraph which we started, there flickers a dark pathway between causality and the aesthetic dimension, between doing and appearing. Now, for centuries, Western philosophy tried to simplify reality by separating mechanical from aesthetic, assuming that everything could be divided into neatly defined, predictable categories. Galileo's view from nowhere led us to the illusory perception of a world composed of clear and definite objects, whose interactions can be completely disentangled within the causal sphere. But this split is artificial. Objects are woven into a mysterious network of relations affecting each other in ways that cannot be fully measured or untangled rationally. We need to break down the boundary between causality and aesthetics, understanding that things don't exist only as cause and effect, but also as presences, inherent vitalities, and imponderable evidence that require a different kind of seeing, a different mode of thought. Morton calls that new mode ecognosis, a form of knowing that isn't about control, but about allowing things to reveal themselves on their own terms. It's like adjusting to the unfamiliar without expecting it to become familiar. Morton describes it as a weird kind of knowing, a self-aware, looping awareness that accepts both the oddness and the beauty of the unknown along the dark path, precisely in this zone of indeterminacy and mystery where causality and aesthetics intertwine. Ultimately, this vision of weird matter calls for a fundamental change in our relationship with the world. Object-oriented ontology urges us to abandon the modern illusion of total control and to recognize a reality that is dense with opacities, contradictions, and paradoxes. It's a world where the uncanny, the simultaneous strangeness and closeness of things permeates our experience. This is the world we inhabit now, one in which matter possesses its own voice, an inherent power that challenges our understanding and calls us to a new way of existing and acting within it. The idea that everything must be seen through human subjectivity, this default anthropocentrism of Western culture, must now yield to the reality of spaces opaque to human understanding that we encounter in this new geological era. With the scientific man repressed, the enigmatic thing in itself returns today with a vengeance in the Anthropocene, in phenomena that, due to their immense temporal and spatial scale and their complex interrelation with life on Earth, challenge our capacity for comprehension and management, revealing the limitations of human action. They awaken us to a world whose real dimensions and strange and remote make us real dimensions that are strange and remote, make us realize that objects are not simple mental or ideal constructions, but real entities whose primordial reality is withdrawn from human beings. It's recognizing that the Earth isn't an object for us to dissect and control, but a living system that surrounds us, impacts us, and keeps us alive. We're part of its cycles, affected by its rhythms, subject to its power. And so I just now end with a little coda, trying to summarize the main points of what I've been trying to say. So as we grapple with the scale of our impact in this new geological era that some are calling the Anthropocene, we're forced to confront the reality that we're not separate from nature, observing it from a safe distance. The world isn't just a stage for human action. It's an intricate network of forces, rhythms, and lives with its own mystery and autonomy, forces beyond our control. Timothy Morton's hyperobjects don't just challenge our understanding. They reveal that every action we take, every item we discard, every resource we consume ripples across this interconnected web, bouncing back to remind us of the depth we've overlooked. Moreover, psychic reality has been restricted to the subjectivity of rational subjects, capable of turning the messy concrete world into an object of intellectual scrutiny. In place of the reduction of psychic reality to human subjects and the declaration of all matter as inert, or extending the soul at most to the vegetative matter with Aristotle, declaring the mineral world as dead, we need to start seeing the world as animated or ensouled, and its vitality as going beyond our powers of apprehension. But this new sense of psychic reality requires, as well as a willingness to open up and become vulnerable, a new sensibility. Not so much a nose that searches for depth and meaning and hidden connections, but the nose of common animal sense that evokes an aesthetic response to the world, which ties the individual soul immediately with what we might call, with James Hillman, the world soul. And this shift invites us into a deeper, more grounded way of knowing. It's not about pinning everything down, explaining and measuring through an external rational standpoint. Instead, it's about learning to coexist with the mystery, to sense the presence of things that can't be easily captured in data or formula, to learn to see the invisible and gauge the imponderable. We need to stand at the existential space that knots the actual and the virtual, the interstice between matter and vital spontaneity, between causality and aesthetics, where synchronicities and entanglements occur, irrespective of the type of matter in question, be it mineral, human, and animal or machinic. Perhaps the most visible, valuable insight of the Anthropocene is that we're never truly outside of anything. We are, as Latour imagined, within a thin membrane of life where our actions, our thoughts, our very lives are intertwined with the planet's fate. And this calls for a shift in our attitude and expectations, from control to coexistence, from mastery to mindfulness, from dominance to a profound sense of care. This awareness isn't just intellectual, it's ethical. It calls us to step back from the need to master and exploit and instead approach the earth with a sense of humility and respect. Rather than seeing ourselves as separate and superior, it asks us to view ourselves as one thread in a vast and intricate fabric, interdependent, responsible, and vulnerable. In the end, the earth doesn't need us to thrive, but we undeniably need the earth. Thank you. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. That was fantastic. We already have a few questions in the chat, but we're not going to go to them at this point yet. But you're welcome to continue to contribute questions in the chat. But we're turning now to Dr. Elizabeth Neswold with a response.
Thank you, Trevor. I would like to start by thanking Victor for such a stimulating and thought-provoking paper. I'm honored to have been given the opportunity to engage with the ideas presented here and also to reflect on them from my perspective. And this especially in the light of the most recent events down south for us and up north for you that will inevitably make any cooperation and consensus on environmental action even more difficult. So I'm thinking about how the perceived gap between the human and the non-human can be mediated is even more relevant now. So Victor's paper takes us from Galileo through Kant and then hurls us into the Anthropocene and its dizzying complexity before hinting at ways out, or not out exactly. Counterintuitively, the proposal is not to double down on addressing the impending catastrophes, but to let go of the gesture that assumes that we can control the problems we have created by approaching them from the same intellectual positions that led to them. Instead, he makes a counter-proposal, rooted in Kant's thing in itself, to accept and acknowledge the limits of our comprehension of the world, the things, the interactions, and their complexity. And that entails accepting and acknowledging and emphatically experiencing our intertwinement with this complex global whole in which we are embedded. But this acceptance requires a fundamental revision of how we position ourselves in the world. And this is where Victor's proposal challenges us. An eco-ontology is not just a new way of knowing things, it demands abandoning our old way of understanding ourselves and opening ourselves to the agency of the non-human. So this is an important project, and also, as Victor points out, not just an intellectual exercise, but an ethical necessity. So I very much enjoyed reading this paper, and it comes at a timely moment as the effects of climate change and their unpredictability are becoming more and more visible. So we can no longer have the illusion that nature is something that we can control. So a philosophy that takes the impossibility of control as its starting point is a philosophy for the present moment. So there are so many ideas in this paper that I cannot possibly respond to all of them. So I'm just going to pick up a few moments that resonated particularly strongly with me. The questions that give the direction of Victor's paper are central to developing a productive approach to the challenges posed by climate change and human effects on the environment. So the first is the question of how humans came to see the non-human world as something separate from them. So something to be exploited, dominated, to be subdued and rolled over, to quote Genesis 1:28. This is the how did we get here question. And second, the question of how we can get out of here to a more complex, sustainable, holistic, collaborative interpretation of an interactive global system of which humans are a part. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing the first question. It's been litigated many times in the history of science and philosophy, but I do want to emphasize two connected threads in this first section that wind through the rest of the paper. So the disengagement that separates human and non-human and enables humans to conceive of themselves as sole agents is simultaneously an aesthetic loss. This reminds me a bit of Max Weber's diagnosis in the early 20th century of the Entsalbung der Welt, the disenchantment of the world, through the long process of intellectual disengagement that culminated in modern science. So the observation of a disconnection is not new, but leaving it unaddressed is increasingly untenable for reasons that Victor discusses in this paper. So there is a sense of urgency in the 21st century as the receipts are coming in. So Victor's intervention picks up both ends of the thread by suggesting ways to revive a broadly defined aesthetic relationship to the non-human world, while also dissolving the position of unique human agency into a relational conception of agency shared and distributed among human and non-human actors. So I am not a philosopher. I am a historian of science. So words like ontology and noemno do not flow easily over my lips. The historian space, or at least my historian space, is grittier and more material. So I want to take the opportunity to explore how these two threads of agency and aesthetic connection could look when viewed from within science studies and the history of science. So where do I see resources in my field to ask and respond to the kinds of questions that Victor has brought up? So first, I want to look at the issue of agency. So this question of agents and actors has been a topic of discussion in science and technology studies for quite some time now. And the standard take is that there is on the one side the scientist, the engineer, or the other human actor, and on the other side, the inert material to be acted upon through instruments of human design. The laboratory experimental setup mirrors the human-non-human relationship Victor described in regard to agent and patient, controller and controlled. The experimental turn in the history of science challenged this clear division by showing how both instruments and apparatus that a scientist used and the materials that they were used on resisted the experimenter's intentions, demanded responses, forced adaptations, escaped intelligibility. Andrew Pickering proposed instead that the scientific experiment was an interaction between human and material agency, a zone of encounter or mangle of practice, as he called it, where human intention, human bodies, instruments, artifacts, matter, social relations meet, all of which exhibit forms of agency. So all act and react according to the actions and reactions of other participants in the world of this experiment, a dance of agency, in his words, that included human, social, and non-human actors. So historians of technology have a lot of unresolved issues around this question of non-human agency. Not all agree with it, but this approach did open the door to thinking about human and non-human agency that was rooted in concrete practices in the material world. The question of agency also entered science and technology studies around the same time through actor network theory. Like Pickering's mangle of practice, it viewed humans as only one actor among many, and of human actions taking place within a net of other actors in systems that could be quite complex, and where actions could lead to unpredicted and even unpredictable results. Such systems could include humans, animals, insects, plants, climate, regulatory systems, machines, social systems all at once. So I bring up both of these approaches since they are both ways of thinking about this interaction of actors and actions that are situated firmly in the material experienced world. They do not differentiate between human and non-human, and they include social, technological, biological, and natural systems within their scope. Their themes are explored in individual case studies and deep probings of specific constellations. So they are, in small, defined ways, grappling with similar problems as those presented through the ideas of hyperobjects and weird matter. One question that can be asked here is whether they, and this is ANT more than Pickering's conception, can be scaled up to tackle larger, more complex cases. Another is whether they can offer concrete material anchoring to these hyperobjects and weird matter. That is, to serve as a kind of snapshot or microscopic sample that can shed light on the larger issues at hand. I come now to the question of connections. I want to look at Victor's second thread, which entails an aesthetic repositioning. In a way, the concept of weird matter, with its acceptance of indeterminacy, acknowledgement of a sense of mystery, of complexity, of things beyond understanding, is a re-enchantment of the world, instilling a new sense of awe. But again, aesthetics is not my comfort zone, so I want to translate this into a discussion I feel more comfortable participating in. And instead of aesthetics, I will call this, this is truly, for lack of a better term, holistic connection. And again, I'm going to start small. This time I'm going to start very small with the metabolic turn in the philosophy of biology and in medical sociology. For the former, the work of Hannah Landecker has been formative. So Landecker's work on nutritional epigenetics and her recent paper on inflammation follow the effects of food and social environments into the cellular responses of gene expression. Food becomes the cell's environment, but then so does pollution, stressful working conditions, as well as our microbiome. And all affect how cells react and how genes are activated and repressed. What this means is that we are not simply affected by our environments. These environments make us. Metabolic thinking has also found its way into medical ethnography and sociology as a way to capture the complex relationships between humans, their societies, and environmental entities, such as pollutants, diseases, crops, social systems, economic exchange systems, transportation and food systems, and the way each develops over time and space. As a model, metabolic thinking captures input, protective outgo, waste, transformations, and relationships between both natural and urban ecosystems, and it can grow to include spatially widely distributed and increasingly complex and unpredictable interconnected networks. So what I particularly like about the metabolic approach is that it can draw concrete material lines of interaction that reach from global environments to societies and economies into biomes and cellular and genomic activity. All become relational and reactive, and all are included in processes of production, consumption, and co-production. There are no clear boundaries between a pancreatic cell and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. We are infused with environment, and we are environment. So I want to end these responses with a friendly provocation. I share Victor's conviction that more of the same is not the solution. Geoengineering, electrical vehicles, capturing asteroids to mine them for metals, none of these technological solutions in the vein of more to conquer, more growth, more expansion, are viable solutions to the problems we are globally facing. A radical rethink is necessary. But I would ask, is aesthetics enough? Is simply rethinking enough when material bodies are involved? This view from nowhere that enabled this extraction of the human perspective from its position within the world is not really a view from nowhere. It is a view from somewhere that has concealed its position. So can we find our way to new, more sustainable and more respectful relationship with our non-human environments without also, or first, or simultaneously addressing this position and the human and non-human relationship it carries? Galileo, I think, is getting a bit of a bad rap here, because the objectifying scientific gaze is not the cause, it is the result. So this is my response. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So we do have some questions in the chat, but I wanted to pause for a sec and give Victor Krebs a moment if you wanted to react to any of the points.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, thank you very much for the wonderful summary you've done of my paper. You've pointed out the most important things, and you've touched them from your perspective, which gives a little bit more light, I think, to what I'm thinking. Let me just maybe, let's see first if I can understand my handwriting here. Yeah, there's something about, I think it's very interesting, this issue of agency that you bring up in terms of the, let me call it hermeneutic circle that engages the experimental encounter with the object, right? The object that we're experimenting is affecting us, and we're affecting our observation of it. That's fine. And that, I think, does capture the idea that the agency is not something reducible to the human, but rather is present in the interaction, and so therefore involves non-human elements as well. But I think that there's something about the notion of hyperobjects and they're being immersed in or appearing in this crisis in which we're immersed, and that is an existential urgency that is not present in the experimentation. In experimentation, we're still, we're still in our privileged position, and we are the ones that are figuring things out. What's interesting about hyperobjects and the experience of hyperobjects is that perspective we had is reduced to nil. We are, as it were, being, overrun by the effects or by the effect of the agency from the outside. So it's an existential question that rises beyond the discovery that you're talking about. So that's my first thought about that, which is related to my second thought with regard to what you talk about. You want to change from aesthetics to holistic connection, which I think does the same thing. It's sort of you said you weren't comfortable with the aesthetic section because it's so broad, but it does include the metabolic turn, obviously. I mean, it's metabolization what is involved in aesthetics, because aesthetics is not just the reception of the physiological reception of your body, but also the reception through the senses, aesthesis, right? Which has in us a resonance, an energetic or emotional or affective resonance, right? That I think is important because the logic of that resonance is completely at odds with the logic of rational causal thinking. And so what's interesting about this dark path that Morton emphasizes is that if we acknowledge the depth and inscrutability of reality that comes to us, I mean, the thing in itself cannot be known, but its effects are absolutely evident, especially in this crisis. So the question is, how can we start to look at that, not only from the causal perspective, or rather, how can we complement or complexify the causal relationship, the causal connection that we see there, with the participation or integration also of this existential, I would like to say, emotional, affective resonance that does not need to be reduced to emotional as in human emotional, but also has to do with vibration and resonance. So that eventually, I think that connection, that aesthetic connection, rather than emphasizing the humanity of it, rather dissolves the humanity into the general energetic fields in which the environment can be described, and in which we find ourselves. So those are the two initial responses that I have from your beautiful presentation. That I really thank you again.
Okay, great, thank you. So we do have a lineup of questions here in the chat, which is great. The first one I'll read out, if I can get the name correct. Soraya Kanth. The question is, how is identity defined in posthumanism when human consciousness can be transferred to an artificial body? And does a new body become part of one's identity? Or do you see identity as rooted purely in consciousness?
Wow, I guess that's a question for both of us, right, Elizabeth?
Yeah.
But I can start by saying, yeah, the whole notion of identity that we have, right, and the insular subject is what I called it, the insular subject. This notion that we are, you know, we have a certain autonomy and a certain constitution that allows us to define what our identity is. That is something that is becoming more and more questioned in our time. I mean, the whole I don't want to enter into this more difficult subject, but the gender identity issue, for instance, is a consequence, I think, of a new way of experiencing things, where that fixed identity that we had in our modern viewpoint is starting to become less relevant to what we experience as what it is our experience, our existence in temporality. So it seems to me that the notion of identity is rooted in an ontology, and I'm sorry to use that word again, ontology, as in, you know, metaphysics, as a way of how the world is constructed, that emphasizes substances as permanent entities, atemporal entities, you know, the ideas of Plato, the essences that are behind the appearances. And I think that one of the turns that we have to make is giving up that notion of substance and understanding that identity is something that is always changing. Our identity is a process. It's not a determinate thing. And so I think if we start looking at things in terms of processes rather than entities, substances defined once and for all, then the notion of identity becomes less relevant in that sense, and more sort of approachable in terms of the interaction of things and how things change in time for us. I don't know if that answers the question, but it touches on some of the things that the question raises.
Do you want to add anything, Elizabeth?
I think Victor's response was beautiful. Excellent response. I very much enjoyed it. I think a lot of what he's proposing in this paper, and also what's in mind as well from a different perspective, is that this idea that we are fixed, that there is a closed identity, that it is defined, sort of calcified, identical with itself, is no longer tenable. We are porous, we are open, and the environment affects us. I mean, we can't think of ourselves as being separate and closed anymore, and that means that identity becomes something malleable. But I think Victor said it so much better than I did.
Okay. Okay, good, thanks. We have a question from Gabby Balcarce. What a wonderful talk. It truly encourages us to reflect on the complexity of our present. I was wondering, do you think it's appropriate to refer to the Anthropocene as our era, while at the same time proposing a perspective that is not anthropocentric? And an interesting follow-up second question, is it possible to consider the project of modern science without a capitalist approach?
Those are two wonderful questions. Gabby, thanks. Well, about the Anthropocene, I've had some discussions with Gabby before. And of course, the Anthropocene is a controversial name because there's a paradox involved in it, right? We're calling it the Anthropocene in order to get away from the anthropocentric perspective. But I think as a starting point, and it's not, some people call it the capital scene, which is I think what's suggested by the second part of the question, that it's capitalism, not the anthropos that is behind it. And I would say as a starting point, the anthropocentric, the Anthropocene emphasizes the role that human beings have had because of that narrow perspective on our relationship with the world that we now know as this geological critical moment. And so calling it the Anthropocene is just pointing to the fact that it's our anthropocentric perspective that is responsible for the crisis, but it does not, as it were, endorse that perspective. It rather criticizes it. I mean, to call it the Anthropocene does not mean we have to look at it from the Anthropocene. No, rather, because we've been looking at it as an anthropocentric thing, we need to get rid of that. And that is realizing, first of all, how that perspective has harmed us. So I'm perfectly willing to change that name so that it doesn't make, create that confusion. But I think that that's important. And that distinction that Gabi is making in that question, I think is important to deal with. And then a capitalist approach. Well, when I think, for instance, about digital interconnectedness and digitality in general, just to give an example, the problem, I think, I'm convinced of this, is not the digital. The digital is a new mode, a new means of reformulating, modulating our experience, as any other technology has been in the past. The problem with digitality is that it has been captured by one particular way of looking at things, which is capitalism. And so everything that happens in digitality is geared towards satisfying that worldview. And I think what it does is it restricts the potentiality that digitality has for opening new ways of thinking and perhaps getting away from the perspective that we've been criticizing to start with. So I think that the project of modern science is, if we call modern science what we're criticizing with Galileo and Kant, then it seems to be the case that modern science has wedded capitalism in such a way that we need to start thinking of both in a different way. I don't know if that kind of answers to the complexity of the question, but at least it's a first step.
Did you want to add something, Elizabeth, about these last points about science?
Yes, I completely agree that the modern scientific gaze and capitalism are intertwined. One is not possible without the other. Can a science emerge that is not tied to capitalism in that way? Also, removing from it this gaze, there have been forays into feminist science studies that might offer possibilities that work through a more empathetic approach that does integrate sciences, that does integrate maybe Victor's description of aesthetics, the aesthetics that is a form of interaction. So there is this possibility. It's of course not the dominant mode now because science is happening within the capitalist system. It is more marginalized, but there have been forays in directions. Some of the metabolic thinking also offers possibilities for thinking outside of the objective science, capitalism, distanced gaze thinking. But they are one and the same right now. I would say that capitalism is where the view from nowhere starts and stands. So capitalist economic systems and global power systems. So we have to address these issues along with the gaze, pull them apart. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Actually, connecting with some comments you just made, Elizabeth, regarding gender and feminism, we have a question from Christine Daigle. There's an important critique by material feminists toward the notion of the hyperobject, which posits them as so overwhelming and ineffable that they end up losing their political potency. In their view, hyperobjects are too abstract to trigger the kind of activist, concrete, and urgent action that we need. So I wonder what you're thinking of this notion of problematic aspects of a hyperobject.
Wow, that's an interesting, very interesting question. Thanks. Well, first of all, are they too abstract hyperobjects? I mean, don't we experience them all the time? I mean, what Morton is pointing to is the consequences in our environment of elements that we can't see as a whole, but that we can reconstruct in a way from the effects they have. And these are enormous, and they go beyond what it is that we can grasp as a whole. So I don't think that they're too abstract hyperobjects. On the contrary, it seems to me that they are so concrete that they're a very good starting point to start rethinking about the place we have within them and how it reconfigures our understanding of the world. There was a second part of that question, right? First of the abstract, and what was the second part?
Yeah, well, they're described not only as abstract, but also overwhelming. So that may be another aspect of a hyperobject, not just abstract, which you addressed as the material aspects of hyperobjects, but that they're overwhelming. They're so overwhelming that they're not going to provoke action.
Oh, but don't you think that overwhelming events actually are the most effective in provoking action? I mean, if something's overwhelming, I have to deal how to survive them, or how to, you know, in a way sidestep them or deal with them. I would say my intuition is that overwhelmingness of something is more of a reason to act than not. Of course, the effect might be that because, and maybe that's the thought behind the question, the overwhelmingness can paralyze us, and, you know, keep us just thinking about it in a theoretical framework. But I'm not sure. I would like to see what other reactions are to that. Maybe Elizabeth or even you, Trevor, may say something more about that, because it seems to me there's something probably I'm not getting to the intuition behind the question, because it seems to me that both those issues actually reinforce the practical part of it.
Well, I think it's the immensity of them, the complexity that requires so much effort to get a handle on them, not just necessarily the question of abstractness, but the overwhelming size that can provoke this kind of sense of apathy or inability to act, that I think is, if I understand correctly, is behind the question as well. I don't know if Elizabeth wants to add anything.
Yes, I do. I do share some of the concerns expressed in the question. The sheer complexity of the hyperobjects seems to indicate that we can't do anything, can't understand anything, and have to allow them to flow around us and through us. So I do think there is the danger of it being overwhelming, and that was perhaps buried a bit in my response when presenting small cases, small interventions. Clearly, Pickering's laboratory setup does not have the urgency of hyperobjects. I mean, that's absolutely clear, but it can provide a window, just as ANT or metabolic systems, that small microscopic slice of the hyperobject that is comprehensible in a way, but connected enough to give a sense of understanding, to give a sense of connection to the hyperobject, to make it that much less overwhelming, and that one can see that small part and how the small part works. And that small part connects directly to the large, but gives the possibility of intervention, makes it human-sized, even though, you know, you're talking about we shouldn't have humans as the focus. If we are no longer there, how do we orient? You know, how can we approach something of that immensity? So, you know, my response was in part saying, here are ways to approach the immensity that I can actually get through my head to help me accept or work with that larger that I have to accept can't get into my head.
Yeah, that clarifies what I want to say, because it seems to me you're right about that. But when for instance, when we talk about this dark path or this ecognosis, as Morton calls it, we have to give up on the need to understand and to explicate and to grasp in the head, as you say. You know, I can't get in my, but rather start to think in another way that is more how to put it, contemplative in a way, but also contemplative not in the sense of not acting, but waiting for things to evolve and to emerge from that contemplation that will give you reasons to act. So believe, in other words, I mean, and underlying the whole paper that I've read is the notion that part of what it means to develop a new sensibility is reactivate in us ways of apprehending that are not rational. And that's where art comes in, right? Where art will present something that really impacts you and drives you to action, even though there is no connection to your understanding. There's an immediate visceral reaction that comes from something maturing in you at a different level than the level of rationality. And so perhaps confronting these overwhelming realities, first of all, acknowledging their overwhelmingness, right? And assuming that we have a different path to learn from that, rather than trying to understand, to live with not understanding. I mean, I think Keats used to call that negative capability, the ability to stand before mystery without looking for some explanation to get you out of it, hoping that distress may be, if you're accepting it, the source of new insight and new ways of acting. You know, it sounds a little magical, but I think it does have to do with this rediscovering areas of our understanding of the world, of our relationship to the world that are not subjected to the rational, that have to do with potentialities we have more in the sensible and the body. But there are certain things in the body that react that may give us a path out of the problem.
I wanted to follow up on this question of agency. I think what may be behind it as well is if we see hyperobjects as having a characteristic of agency, forgive me for putting it crudely, but whose agency is stronger or bigger? Would we say human agency is diminished as a result of the agency of the hyperobject, or is human agency comparable or equivalent to the agency in hyperobjects? Because as I understand this question, it's a bit of a competitive environment in the sense that there's human agency in the face of the agency coming from that which is outside of us. So we can, I see this also as kind of an attempt to give value to the non-human by endowing it or by saying it has a characteristic of agency. And that opened the door to the question of what is the fate of human agency in relation to the agency of other objects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
So can I frame it a bit different? Would we say that humans have comparable agency to hyperobjects?
I would say that yeah, no, thanks for rephrasing it that way. It makes it clear for me what my answer is. My answer is both human agency and non-human agency are the same, have the same source. And so precisely the moving away from the anthropocentric is trying in some way to connect to this, I don't want to call it universal agency, but underlying inscrutable unity of agencies that have different manifestations, so that there's not competition, but rather the need to find affinity and resonance. That would be the idea.
Could we also differentiate between different types of agency in the sense that there's an agency that's directed toward the mastery of nature, and there's an agency that's less harmful or less problematic? And we shouldn't necessarily equate the two types of human agency in relation to the agency of the hyperobject. In other words, not all human agency is the same in terms of its effect or benefits.
Right. And I would say, I don't know, Elizabeth, what you would say, but I would say that the agency that is destructive is the agency that does not acknowledge its source in the same place that the agency that they're trying to combat has its source. So in other words, positive agency, positive human agency is the agency that has already attained a perspective that is not the anthropocentric.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how that sounds to you, Elizabeth. I'm interested to know, because from your perspective, I would like to hear what your reaction to that is.
I find that went in a few too many circles here. If we're acknowledging agency of the non-human, then we are equally agents. But I don't think every agent has the same effect. So maybe we can think about it in terms of of effects, that climate change is going to have a much bigger effect on us than we are going to have on climate change in the meantime. You know, our effectivity in that regard is that train has left the station. So maybe think about it that way, not, you know, priority or dominance, but the strength of the effect. Agency is, I would say, first off, it will be value neutral if we're looking from a position outside the human, because we are what carries values.
Right.
So we can just say, this happens. It is neither good or bad. It is good or bad for something.
Okay.
For someone. So that would be also a decentering of the human perspective. What is good, and we look at most of this as saying what is good or bad for us, because our survival as a species is important. So I'm not sure if we can ever really get away from a human-centered perspective, because that would also mean saying whether or not humans continue to exist is no more important than whether feral pigs continue to exist. And we are more invested in our continuing existence. So I'm not sure if we ever want to really radically decenter in that way. That is creating another view from nowhere. That's kind of the topic of a lot of post-apocalyptic doom visions. I think of like the world without us, which is, let's imagine humans are gone. So I'm not sure if radically removing the human perspective is going to be long-term helpful, because we do want the humans to continue. I mean, I'm assuming, you know, post-human does not mean non-human, you know, end of human, we're gone. Yeah, so those are my thoughts there. I mean, do we really want to get rid of our perspective and have another view from nowhere?
That's excellent. Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that brings us to the central topic of our conversation, which is the post-human. What is the post-human? What does it mean to move away from the anthropocentric? Does it mean to give up the notion of our survival? I think that the question is not whether we give it up or not, but how we understand what human survival involves. Because if human survival is conceived from an anthropocentric perspective, then obviously we've got to fight everything that's going to and somehow threaten our conception of what our survival is. But if our survival is conceived in a different way, and that's the big issue, how could we conceive it? And I think the aesthetic path gives us a way of opening it up from just, you know, human aesthetics to material interaction. Big thing. We could have another session on that. But you're right. I mean, what this poses as a central question is, how are we to conceive of ourselves, and what it means for human beings to survive, and what that will require, and how that can be made to, in some way, be attuned to how the world is moving in these cases, right? There's always a phrase that I get from Giorgio Agamben, who's disappeared lately. I haven't read any more. I mean, I think he disappeared after the pandemic, I think. But the thing is, he said something that I thought was very important. It's not a matter of overcoming the catastrophe we're living. It's a matter of learning to live in it, within it, to make that catastrophe something that we can somehow thrive from.
Can I ask one other question about objects and hyper-objects? Do you differentiate between those hyper-objects that humans have brought about, like climate change, for example, and other hyper-objects that would be happening whether humans existed or not, whether it be, you know, what's happening with planetary movements? And I was reading this morning about, apparently, Andromeda Galaxy has 400 billion stars in it, and it's going to be crashing into the Milky Way at some point in the distant future. And who knows what will happen when these two galaxies crash. Certainly, humans are irrelevant to that question or that event. So how do you differentiate these different types of hyper-objects?
No, that's interesting. Those events obviously do constitute part of this symbiotic whole that we're trying to talk about. So they would be relevant, even though we don't feel their impact on us. I'm more interested in going the other way, rather than thinking of those, you know, intergalactic events, what's happening within our own bodies.
Mm.
I mean, because I think the notion that there's an inscrutable side to objects it becomes evident in these gigantic events that are happening. But if you think about it, the psychoanalytic notion of the unconscious is nothing but the recognition of that inscrutable side to the matter of our bodies, to the matter of what feeds our minds. So that the most important, I think, insight behind this is that we have to recognize that hyperobjects are just one example, the most evident example of something that we have stopped seeing since we had this notion of control and you know, limitation to knowledge that came with the modern scientific, to understand reality as much more inscrutable and mysterious, and yet something we have to live through without denying it. Is it an avowal of the unconscious, which means how do we deal now with that? How do we incorporate it into our notion of the world and who we are? So I think that I would go in that direction rather than the other direction. But I think that the intuition is the same. Well, how does that? What are the consequences of this, right?
I think the unconscious raises questions about whether we're not only masters of nature outside of us, but certainly the theories of the unconscious demonstrate that we're not masters within our own house.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've reached the end of the time and of the questions that were in the chat discussion. So I wanted to thank you both very much for your presentation and response and for the discussion. And we will be posting this on the YouTube channel in the near future. And as I said at the introduction, we're going to be hosting events with the Latin American Posthumanism Network in the winter of this year, 2025, and then 2 events in 2025-26. So please stay tuned. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. That was fun.